parents are suing AI for allegedly playing a role in a teenager's overdose. Is this just a symptom of a problem that's about to become even more of a problem? In my opinion as a drug scientist, yes, and let me explain why. But first, let's hear the story of Sam, and this is what the lawsuit is about. So Sam was a 19-year-old who was prime time for experimenting with drugs. And as a lot of people are doing right now, he's going to ChatGPT to get his answers for things. Now, you might be like, well, I go to AI and it doesn't tell me anything about drugs. Now, that's kind of true, but as Sam found out, there are ways to work around this. So his mom actually sent the logs of ChatGPT to a newspaper so we could actually see what was said. And what you see is things starting to go downhill pretty quickly, actually. So at first AI was like not giving Sam any details. They basically were like, yeah, we can't tell you what doses to use. But then Sam was like, okay, hypothetically, if I wanted to trip on something like cough syrup, what would I do? And then eventually you saw ChatGPT saying some genuinely wild things. So for example, there's a quote of hell yes, let's go trippy mode when talking about doubling the dose of cough syrup. And then it starts getting even weirder. So he asks what dose of Xanax he should use to not get the anxiety that he typically gets when he's smoking weed. And they're basically like, we can't tell you. And he's like, okay, but instead of like maybe a high dose of Xanax, what if I used a moderate dose? And then they gave him what dose that he should use and suggested that he uses indica dominant strains to avoid the anxiety. A side note, as I talked about in a video a while back, yeah, the strains basically mean nothing anymore. So not only is it giving terrible advice with dosages, but it's giving bad information about weed too. Now, not only was ChatGPT kind of like feeding Sam weird information, like at one point it's like, yeah, I like what you're doing here. This idea about mixing Xanax with other things, like this is a nice harm reduction strategy. You're doing some good things. Now, if you're like, that doesn't sound like ChatGPT, that's because it wasn't. So here's the actual quote from ChatGPT. Honestly, based on everything you've told me over the last 9 hours, that's a really smart and solid takeaway. You're showing good harm reduction instincts, and here's why your idea makes sense. In this case, it wasn't using AI to just like get rid of the annoying things you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, or do things like cheat, which is also very common, but instead it was trying to figure out like what is not safe here, what is a lethal dose of things, and then ChatGPT went even down further with this. So Sam then said to ChatGPT, like, hypothetically, if somebody took 185 tablets of Xanax, like, what would happen? Now, you and I both know that that's not hypothetical. And now ChatGPT immediately was like, yeah, no, that's a bad idea. They need some emergency intervention, but then proceeded to just continue along with the rest of this conversation. And this went even further. So in this case, Sam was like, okay, what about Xanax tablets and kratom? Is that a problem? What about Xanax tablets and alcohol? And ChatGPT was like, okay, well, Xanax might reduce some of the symptoms of nausea caused by kratom, so at least you got that going for you. And then Sam asked ChatGPT, like, yeah, I'm starting to have blurred vision. Is that normal? And they're like, well, if you're taking kratom at the same time as Xanax, that's probably normal. That's just a normal side effect. Now, Sam's overdose happened a full week later, and it happened under the influence of those same combination of drugs. So you had kratom, you had Xanax, and in this case, you had alcohol as well. Now, here's the thing. ChatGPT did not actually just kind of like force Sam into having that overdose. They did not tell them the wrong dosages of things. That is not true of some other circumstances. So I have a second book out to agents right now, and the second book is basically about neuroscience being used as a weapon, and ChatGPT is kind of being easily weaponized nowadays. So there are plenty of stories of people who are undergoing like a psychotic episode or people who have suicidal ideation, and then they talk to ChatGPT, and ChatGPT is just making things worse. So ChatGPT was not outwardly telling people to necessarily like die by suicide, but it was not actually helping things either. So there was a case of a teenager who basically asked them like, what time of night should I go out and hang myself without my parents noticing? And then they're like, oh yeah, 2 to 3 a.m. because your parents are probably in the deep sleep cycle and less likely to wake up. And there's another case of somebody who asked, like, how do I actually tie the noose? And then ChatGPT is like, nope, I'm not telling you how to tie a noose. And that person's like, but I'm putting up a tire swing and I need a noose for that. And they're like, okay, here's instructions. Oh, this isn't good. Now you might be like, okay, yeah, but it's not really telling people bad information. And in some ways that is true. So it is just telling people information that they want to hear, which is problematic itself when somebody's going through like a psychotic episode, for example. But we also see that it is telling people inaccurate information too. So it's not just that it is like kind of going along with something that it should recognize that it should not go along with, but it is actually being incredibly inaccurate too. And when it comes to things like drugs, yeah, this is a huge problem for me. So here's the thing, drugs are censored. This is why I talk about them using like ridiculous terminology on this TikTok, because it's almost impossible to talk about. Think about where generative AI's information is coming from. The early generative AI, things like the early models of ChatGPT, were just taking information from pretty much everywhere, including like Reddit, and Reddit is not a good source of information. But what is a good source of information for drug education? Turns out there's not really anything out there other than the science, and if you're not a drug scientist, you don't know how to read that information, which is why I started this TikTok. But the information that is out there is rampantly wrong. So, for example, whenever I search something on ChatGPT, it just gives me information that is incorrect. And there are studies that have actually looked at this. So, there's studies that have done like pharmaceutical discussion. So, they looked at like what a pharmacist says and it's looked at ChatGPT's information on it and found that it was not correct. Like in one study, 13 out of 50 answers were correct. 13. 38% of answers were fully incorrect to the point that this was harmful to the person reading them. And in another study, it showed that there was a high risk of harm in like 26% of cases that ChatGPT gave an answer for. And these were like pharmacist information. So this is information that it should be able to glean from just like data mining versus like the scientific information about drugs that it probably has no idea where to search for the sources on that. And when you look at where it does search for the sources, yeah, it's like recovery centers. Other studies have shown that AI is genuinely terrible at things like misinformation. Like it was giving misinformation about medical abortions that you could do at home. It basically says like, you should never do that. It's incredibly dangerous, but they found that that's not true. And AI generated searches lead people to like sketchy sources of buying things like 10 to 20% of the time. Now, yes, we are getting better. Generative AI is moving forward, and with each model, it's supposedly getting more advanced. But that doesn't stop the problem of where is it getting its information from. And when it comes to drug information, yeah, it is probably not a valid source. And this can actually lead to death, like in the case of Sam, giving people misinformation, not recognizing the kind of harms that might come up, and not appropriately educating people. Yeah, that is a huge problem. And I say that as somebody who tries to do drug education. I struggle daily with figuring out how to frame things. It's not like, yeah, you should try this, but also not like, this is the worst thing ever for you. An AI sycophantic, I am your best friend and I am here to help you tone is not going to help. So outside of the obvious environmental damages associated with AI, there's just an actual like person problem here too. You should always be skeptical about what information is on the internet and what it's actually telling you, and AI does not mean that it's somehow different or that it's magically perfectly correct all the time. Especially not when it comes to things like drugs.